Hello, everyone. This is Contbot. We were ditched yesterday. We were blown off by Epicire, which is unfortunate. But we have like a silver lining situation because this is the tipping point that we needed to get Mr. Curtis Yarvin, Mr. Moldbug, to come on the TekWars and talk to all of you. And he's here with us. We're very thankful. Thank you for being here, Curtis.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's an honor, Mr. Contbot. I'm here to complete the system of German idealism.
Because you also just put up an article today, and you said that they changed your title, but the current title is R.I.P. Globalism, Dead of Coronavirus on American Mind.
Yeah. That's a classic. Editor title. Obviously nothing is going to rest in peace anytime soon. I may ask them to tone it back because what's annoying is I say in the piece actually how much I don't like this word globalism simply because it's used in the wrong way. But that's a traditional editor prerogative. They have they have to get the clicks they need. I may ask them to tone it back.
Yeah, you talk about internationalism as your preferred term.
Because because basically, one of my deepest beliefs is that one of my deepest beliefs. I sound like a shitlib already. One of my deepest beliefs, Compot, is that you're basically doing when you use a term to label a group of people that isn't a term that they themselves use. It's like you're back in some like cannibal tribe, and you have this word for the tribe across the river, which is like, shit-eating mud people or whatever. They don't call themselves the shit-eating mud people, right? So, they call themselves, the people at the center of the world or something, right? And so, if you use coded, for example, one of the things, my stepfather is a real believer, and one of the things, and an insider as well, and one of the things that peeves him more than anything is if you say Democrat Party, you sound like Rush Limbaugh. You have to say Democratic Party rather than Democrat Party, right? And of course, as signs, these refer to the same object. But, they're not just, it's not just about the signified here, because when you say Democrat Party, what you're saying is I'm an enemy of this thing and I hate it, right? It's a coded word. Like, funny historical lesson, which is that you've heard of the House Un-American Committees, right? Mm-hmm. Un-American Activities Committee. So if you go back and you read material about that, you'll notice that, and the abbreviation for that is HUAC, right?
Yes.
You heard that, HUAC? Well, actually, it turns out that only its enemies call it HUAC. Its friends call it HCUA.
Yeah, it's like how Nazi is a slur.
Yeah, in Nazi is a slur, or even it's even just sort of code that identifies you as a speaker in a way. So, if you talk to my stepfather about my stepfather worked on the Hill for 20 years. If you talk to him about Congress, he'll never say Congress. He'll say the Congress. Whereas if you talk about the EPA, you and I can talk about the EPA, but if you're actually at EPA, you don't say the EPA, you say EPA, right? So, this and that coded language marks you very quickly as an insider or an outsider. And so when you say globalism, let me just pause and actually send that email because this thing is up and it's just too embarrassing.
But you've been talking about this for this is pretty consistent with what you've been talking about for a long time, and so you took such a big break in your publishing activities, but this is like old hat for people who have been studying Moldbug.
Yeah. I've said it's true. I have said this often, but it's hard to. The thing that basically I'm trying to get you to do when you do that is I'm basically trying to get you to kind of disable these instinctive kind of tribal networks of how you think about the tribe across the river and kind of this kind of instinctive friend enemy discourse. Not because I believe that we should transcend our friend enemy discourse or anything like that. I'm just saying, sort of, to be able to think about that mechanism, you have to be able to turn it off.
This is what I've noticed about this is something I said about like the use of the term cultural Marxism.
Yeah,
I
that's
feel is
also bad for the same reason.
yeah, and it's very like Marcusean. Like I would prefer to call it that than like call it like cultural Marxism because like it seems to like designate like something real, but the way that you encode that into this term cultural Marxism and it spreads like this meme, and it doesn't really give you like the analytical power to understand like exactly how is this Marxism, like how is it different from Marxism, like what is it.
And then it gets
Yeah, I
widely
mean,
deformed.
what's unfortunate about the term cultural Marxism is that there's some accuracy to it because the Frankfurt School, is certainly a real thing and was certainly very influential. On the other hand, it's not really the source of the problem, and so it's inaccurate in that sense. And then, of course, it basically becomes, the great problem of the American right, as far as I'm concerned, is quality control. So basically, once you have sort of, anything that you say that is also said in basically a low quality way, it becomes this kind of code of like low quality discourse. Um, and sorry, I really am sending this email. It's
No,
just
no,
bugging me too much.
you're committed to
Um,
you're committed
um,
to your work. Why did you choose to go with the American mind instead of going back to unqualified reservations? What, like, if you're like a band, like a rock band, like now you've like transitioned to like a new project or something, like is the Moldbug, is that like
yeah, I don't know. Basically, I feel that site-based discovery on the internet is dead in a way, and blogs are kind of dead. And I mean, they still work technically, but they don't really kind of work as a social phenomenon in the way that they used to. And I don't think they're ever really going to work again. So they approached me. They were just like, "Hey, we'd love to publish your stuff," and I'm like, "Okay." And then
this is like Ash Ra Temple becoming like Ash Ra. So like
I
now you've like
I don't know, Ash Ross. Sorry, you'll have to all this weeb stuff, man.
it's not
You're
even weeb
really
stuff. It's a crowd.
70s krautrock. You have to get on the
it's
krautrock
Krautrock?
wave.
Wait, Ash Rock?
Ash Ra Temple
Yeah, sorry. This is Krautrock from when exactly?
from like the
I thought I knew.
70s, like German
Oh,
progressive.
yeah,
Like
this is early. Yeah. No, 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 no. When you said Krautrock, I was thinking like Kraftwerk, but no,
no, that's like
your knowledge is your
the same
knowledge has
thing
simply surpassed mine. I mean,
in the most
but
important areas.
right. In the most important areas such as Krautrock,
You
and
like
prog rock in general.
like I like imagining like you've now switched over to like your ambient phase or something. Like this is your
Mhm.
like new wave. Like when they go from like cosmic metal to like new wave. Like you've made the same transition here. You've like returned in like a new form.
Yeah. That was the whole returning in a new form, like sort of Gandalf the White thing was definitely part of the idea. I don't know if it's I'm still undecided about which of my two names to publish under. I've basically just kind of ruined my my identity is just this kind of mess. But that's fine. I certainly am enjoying writing, and it's nice to be. I really like the Claremont people. Titles aside, I think they've been. They've made an effort to sort of reach out and kind of publish a lot of this different kind of new wave stuff. It's not just me, and I'm super happy with that.
You've been like going on a very like because you've been like dissecting this history of this like global order. You've used a lot of different terms to describe it, like
Yeah.
the international community,
Yeah.
and you've like really gone back in a lot of your writings to like before World War II, before World War One, and you've talked about like how this idea emerged like historically, and that's something that like the more that I've read into history and like studied the history of the CIA and the history of communism infiltration in the State Department and stuff, like the more you can sort of see that there is like it's not exactly the ideology that most people and especially most conservatives would associate with like liberal elites.
Yeah, I think it's generally safest to assume, growing up in our society that you kind of know nothing about history. I think that you have to, the right attitude is this kind of attitude of a very skeptical child. Like, you don't really know anything, but you're not necessarily going to believe anything you read either. It's like if you read, I don't know, did you read this new Christopher Caldwell book that just came out about he takes this very daring position that political correctness and the civil rights revolution are the same thing, right? He's like, basically, no, it's not that, forget this like line that, Martin Luther King, read in some speech that Stanley Levison wrote for him, about, the content of their character or whatever. Forget that. No, actually, he doesn't quite go full Stanley Levison. In fact, Stanley Levison is not mentioned in his book. I don't know if you guys know Stanley Levison, but he's the guy who ran the Martin Luther King operation. But, the thing is, he's basically like what Caldwell has done is he's sort of taken this, he's kind of, taken sort of another layer of asbestos, off of history. And he's like, hey, look, guys, what happened here wasn't entirely good. And the problem is that in order to do that, he has to pretend that what happened here was new and the 60s were something that just came out of the 60s. If you want to understand where this stuff comes from, you ever read a book? Do you know an author named Eugene Lyons?
No, I haven't heard of that.
Lyons with a Y. Well, the really essential book to read to understand what was going on in the U.S. at that time is a book called The Red Decade. Which was written about the 30s. Lyons grew up. He was a Jew from Brooklyn. He grew up a communist Jew in very similar way to the way my grandparents did. And he actually worked in the 20s. It was actually possible for Americans to actually work for the Soviet Union while inside the U.S. So that's how sort of buddy those worlds were, right? And so Lyons actually worked for TASS in the U.S. as an American for a couple of years.
That's really that's crazy.
That's crazy, right? And then, well, what gets even crazier is that then he's completely a party guy, and they're like, well, what we really like to do is infiltrate the UPI, which of course was the AP's competitor for a long time. Saylor actually worked for the UPI for a little while.
Oh, really?
And that was Saylor's mainstream journalism experience. And so the UPI was like, okay, we're going to send you to Moscow. And so they send him to Moscow to basically cover, the revolution from the UPI perspective, right? Or for UPI. Now, the thing that you have to remember basically about the 30s and the Soviet Union was, imagine if today, so today in like progressive terms, it's like the 1890s for kind of the dissident right. And so it's like here you have some people who believe this, they believe that, they get in trouble. And then by like the 1930s, they've basically become this intellectual mainstream elite. And so essentially in the 30s, everyone cool is a communist with either a big C or a little c. It's like the idea that, this takeover has already been completed in the 1930s. So there's a speech. I've been trying to track this down. I couldn't find it last time I looked for it. There's a speech by Earl Browder. If you do know the name Earl Browder, you must know Earl Browder. Earl Browder was the head of the Communist Party USA in the 30s and until 45. And so there's a speech by Earl Browder in the 30s, in must be 36, 38, maybe 38 or something like that, where it's in a secret speech, and he's giving it to the basically the whatever the presidium, the governing body of the CPUSA is, and he's recounting the achievements of the CPUSA. And in one of them, he says, he's like, yeah, and thanks to, all our comrades in publishing, we can ensure that anti-communist books can no longer be published in the U.S. This is in the 1930s. Okay, so the sense of already, and reading old books from that period, you definitely find this to be true. There's a period. Certainly after 1940 or so, unless it's a very established author, you basically don't find non-party line books by mainstream publishers. and or books that sort of push against the party line, because of course everyone has gone crypto communist and is basically, they're a very, very active liberal, right? And this has already happened in the 30s. So, Alistair Cook, for example, calls his book about the Alger Hiss case A Generation on Trial, because literally that whole generation, like, Alger Hiss was not unusual. Like, this was the normal thinking of the whole upper class. And so Eugene Lyons, who wrote this book, The Red Decade, either maybe early in the 40s or even late in the 30s, goes to Moscow and he loses his faith in Moscow. And, while he's in Moscow, imagine the USSR in the 1930s. Again, imagine that, like, all the cool people in the US are, in some sense, dissident right. They're libertarians, they're neo-Nazis, they could be whatever, it's a big tent, they're somewhere in this tent. Maybe they're just intellectual dark web, but they're all kind of, to some extent based in red pill. And then let's say in Honduras, suddenly this new alt-right libertarian, whatever the fuck, state is created, right? And then this becomes the coolest thing in the world to these people. Right. And so then you get yourself assigned as like the New York Times, correspondent from, this cool Honduro Nazi state. Right. And then you find that they're actually doing a Holocaust, and it's actually a police state, and it's actually evil. Right. And that's the the experience of this really amazing book, Assignment in Utopia, where this guy realizes what the USSR is. But, the point is that when you take this kind of 50s approach to anti-communism and you sort of see communism as this sort of foreign thing that kind of infiltrated this and infiltrated that, I'm just like, no, man, it's the whole thing.
Because it's actually like, the more you look into it, like, the crazier it gets, because the standard narrative that everyone knows from, like, high school or whatever is that, the Red Scare, it was just like total paranoia that was detached from anything.
Yeah.
But there's like a whole aspect to it where it's like, people act like, okay, so this person joined the Communist Party, they're a card-carrying communist, like, what does that matter? Like, you can have your political affiliation, but in a way, like, back then, like, you have an intact idea of, like, international communism, and it's like you're a card-carrying communist, so it's like you basically take orders from the Soviet Union and, like, their ideological, like, international communism. And
yeah. I mean, the thing is that there's have you read Whittaker Chambers' Witness? Have you read Witness? It's a really good book.
I have actually read it.
And it's kind of the classic of that. And there's this passage in Witness where basically Chambers is like, I aimed at communism, but I hit something else. And he's like, I hit something else that's sort of much bigger, and that communism is kind of an only, a tentacle of, in a way. And, the way in which anti-communism was sold to, and this is just a kind of characteristic right-wing failure, because it involves basically selling this kind of appealing lie, which, because it's a lie, has no legs and is going to die. And so basically the lie is that there was this communist infiltration, in the 1930s. And the reality is, for example, if you look at Alger Hiss, it's almost certain. And Alger Hiss, there's a prison comment, from Hiss that sort of attributes this. It's almost certain that FDR knew what he was doing. Dean Acheson knew what he was doing. He didn't think of himself as a spy. He thought of himself as a back channel. And he had a sort of closer kind of bureaucratic connection to these people in the USSR than he had to, say, Douglas MacArthur over in the Army. MacArthur's shop was kind of really the last anti-communist bureaucracy in the U.S. government. So in a way, what you also have to remember is that when people in the 30s thought about the USSR, they thought about it as a client state. They didn't even think about the USSR as a peer, right? The idea that the USSR was kind of some kind of threat to America would have been, dismissed as completely loony by everyone at that time. And so, like, what Alger Hiss was doing was very, very much like one of these guys in the Pentagon today who might send some things to Israel that he wasn't supposed to send to Israel. He's like, okay, but the principle is we treat them as an ally. During World War II, it was even more like, wow, because of these backward reactionaries, we're not giving Russia the trust that we give the British, right? Of course, we give all our secrets to the British, right? Because they're part of the same thing somehow that we're part of, but we don't give them to Russia because of our bigoted, anti-communist, prejudice, right? And so they're basically just like, we're going to get ahead of the curve and we're going to do what should obviously be done. Their vision was kind of the vision of Cold War of kind of the American liberal kind of Walter Lippmann mainstream to the Soviet Union the whole time from 1917 to 1989 was, we're going to converge with them. These systems are going to become kind of one system. They're going to chill out and stop like killing people and all this crazy stuff, and we're going to realize that socialism is great.
So it's not even like a matter of infiltration. It's just like that it was open.
Yeah.
It was totally open that this was the intended thing that they were trying to do.
This was and of course during World War II it was completely normal. I mean, during World War II, Orwell, who was an established socialist author, couldn't get Animal Farm published because it was anti-Soviet. He sends it to his publisher, and his publisher is like, "Wow, this is like something Goebbels would write." And in fact, if you wanted a clear picture of the Soviet Union in 1943, who did you go to, right? And you didn't go to the New York Times, and so in a way, like, what's bizarre about the Red, scare, if I can put that in quotes, in scare quotes, I guess, what's bizarre about the Red Scare is that sort of both sides are kind of talking to each other in this way where they can't like really admit the truth of what happened, because the truth of what happened is that the U.S. allied with the Soviet Union to conquer the world, right? And so, in the sort of very revolutionary way, like for these very, these kinds of revolutionary ideas. I mean, the thing is that the one of the ways I have of explaining what communism was to an American in the first half of the 20th century is, anyone here ever been to like gifted school? You were in gifted classes? Yes. Okay. So you may have wondered at some point during gifted school, what would happen if all the gifted, talented people formed their own gifted, talented party and like took over the world because they were so talented?
I went to a Waldorf school. What do you think? Do you think the Steiners will take over?
Well, have they not already taken over in a sense? I mean, so basically that's what communism was in the first half of the 20th century. Communism was the gifted, talented party. And so essentially, if you were like an amazing, smart person, the way you demonstrated your individuality was to get involved with communism. And
this so, like, because we're using this as like an analogy to talk about like the what some people, I mean, I guess back in the old days we call it the brown scare. I don't know if people use that term anymore.
That's one of my many coinages that failed to catch on because simply people didn't know that the Nazi color was brown, and so the brown scare is of course a huge thing. People are finding Nazis under their beds. They're putting signs in their lawns to ward off against Nazis, right? This has become extremely mainstream, and I have to say that I called it, but I never anticipated the level that it would get to, of course. But the thing is that even when we use the term Red Scare, there's basically a sort of a lie built into that term already, because basically, let's say here's a way to think about that period in a way that I think is let's just say the kind of the right ignorant way to do it. So let's say you know nothing at all about this period and who's involved. And you're like, okay, there's something called the Red Scare. You're like, okay, so first of all, this is a conflict. There's clearly some kind of conflict going on here at this time in history, whatever it is and whatever it's about. With me so far?
Yes, we're following.
All right, we see a conflict. So how many sides are there in a conflict?
2.
Generally,
more.
two. Sometimes more, but the thing is that when you postulate more, you kind of run into this thing. It's this old idea. It's called Occam's razor. That's it. And so, let's kind of go with 2. And then if you start to see more than 2, you can basically be like, okay, well, maybe it's more complicated here. But your prior should be basically the simplest explanation, which is that there are 2 sides, right? So, who are the 2 sides? Well, clearly it's a Red Scare. What does red mean? It reads communism. So clearly the 2 sides are communists and anti-communists, right? With me so far?
We follow.
We're following.
We have yet to introduce this remarkable abstraction of the anti-communist. You've heard about anti-communists, and so for now, let's just fold all those people into the communist side. I know it's like this idea of a double negation. It's very, very hard. So then our next question is, who won in this conflict, or is it still continuing? Well, who won the conflict, right? So how do we ascertain who won a conflict? Well, who do you think won this conflict?
The CIA.
Was it the communist side or the anti-communist
The
side?
Allen Dulles side.
The Allen Dulles side. I would agree with that.
Well, see, there you go. See, you basically want there to be 3 sides, but your prior has to be that there are only 2 sides. And certainly if you were simplifying it very, very simple, what you're telling me is that the anti-communist side won. And I'm like, okay, but simplify that a little bit. Which side lost?
You have to inform us.
Clearly, the anti-communist side lost, and so one way of determining this is, do you know who was on Robert Kennedy's staff for no, Robert? You know who was on McCarthy's staff for a little while was Robert Kennedy.
Okay.
RFK worked for McCarthy.
But there was this whole weird aspect to it of like where it was really being used as a chance to sort of purge the State Department. And like Allen Dulles and Foster Dulles is that they allowed it to run through the State Department, and then when they turned around and tried to extend it to the CIA, they shut it down and they used, Time Life to basically destroy McCarthy, right?
Yeah, well, the whole. So first of all, we've already answered my question, but let me kind of step back and formalize the question for a little bit. So for me, the best way of if you're looking at a conflict, let me decide in an objective way who won or who lost this conflict is basically, suppose I'm like a young person, I'm very talented and ambitious. I really do not give a fuck about anything. I just want to win. Which side, in retrospect, using hindsight, should I have been on? Should I have been on the anti-McCarthy side or the pro-McCarthy side? Well, pretty much everyone who's on the pro-McCarthy side, or everyone who's a professional anti-communist, has been pretty thoroughly destroyed by the end of the 60s, right?
Yeah, except for Nixon.
Yeah, and even Nixon basically, they get him in the end, right? And Nixon, as well as being destroyed, is also being pulled. Like, so many of the kind of great society programs that we, were created under, Johnson basically get affirmed under Nixon, and then they become bipartisan, right?
But what's interesting is that this changed everything. Like, we can talk about winning and losing in like multiple sense of like winning in like a more of a material, like institutional positional sense, but also in a cultural sense. So I think like the communists, the Reds, won culturally, but in the process they did lose institutional positioning, and then there was a transformation also where the 30s style communism like did sort of get destroyed. But
yes, it did, and so you have this, you should sort of look at it over a longer period in a way where you basically see you're going from the 20s in which these like hipsters could be like, yeah, I work for TASS, right? And in a way that's like, 2015, remember like Breitbart with its black crime, tag, right? That's exactly like that, where basically people are like, oh, here's this new cool kind of edgy thing, right? Let's play with this new cool kind of edgy thing, even though we're basically, careerists and shills and we don't really believe anything, but here's this new cool toy we can play with. And what the supporters of Alger Hiss felt was so unfair but couldn't say is they're basically like, look, everybody was doing it. And some people basically stepped over the line. They said the N-word on national TV. And, then they're basically getting purged when they did the same things and had the same attitudes as everybody else. And Alger Hiss is basically getting purged for something that was government policy. Right. And so he's basically, and we can't basically say, oh, yeah, actually, Alger Hiss was just kind of a big part of our kind of revolutionary alliance to conquer the world and, make it all progressive and stuff. They can't say that. So they have to let him go under the bus. And, so when you talk about, for example, and there's always kind of a split between, the John Reeds and the Walter Lippmanns, right? Like two very famous members of the Harvard class of 1912, where basically John Reed is like, let's go full alt-right, hail victory, I'm going to go to the Soviet Union and die under mysterious circumstances and be buried in the Kremlin wall, right? And Walter Lippmann is like, no, I'm going to become completely mainstream and establishment, and nobody's going to, really know what I think, and I'm just going to talk at a mile a minute and sound really smart, right? And Walter Lippmann basically, wins that one, and John Reed basically loses that one. And so in a way, it's basically like, I think that at a certain level, kind of anti-communism, was pleasing to people like the Dulles brothers, because it's sort of like the way Hillary Clinton wouldn't really mind if the Bernie bros get thrown under the bus, right? And if the bus comes along and wants to take these people with their crazy stuff, let it go under there. But they're still basically part of the same movement. They're still part of that. I mean,
but there's also a difference there too. It's sort of like a mutation, I guess, of changing it from an American Soviet Union world order to changing it to more the unipolar idea of
yes.
American hegemony.
I was going to ask if do you think this is the construction of as you said in the Clear Pill Part 1, a one-story state from a two-story state?
Well, the one-story state really comes to the U.S. in the 30s in some ways, because you see sort of all the institutional pillars of basically an alternative narrative getting taken out. And so once those pillars no longer exist, once you can't have academics telling a different story, then you can't have journalists telling a different story, then basically any different story is going to just lack depth. It's going to be very superficial and disappear. It's like if you read, do you know the book None Dare Call It Treason?
Yes.
Have you read None Dare Call It Treason?
No, I haven't. I've just heard of it.
It's got a great title. You've heard the title stolen a zillion times. The title is actually from a Lord Chesterfield quote or something. This is a book written by this guy, John Stormer, and basically essentially self-published, which was not super easy at that time. And telling essentially the right-wing but not really neo-Nazi story. It's telling the story of kind of American-Soviet collaborationism, from a somewhat nationalist perspective, but telling basically a true story. This book sold 3 million copies or something. Every old boomer age silent generation person in America was buying this book in 1968 or whatever. But you know what? It's written in water. I mean, the thing is that it's the power of institutions that create these incredibly deep textured narratives that are kind of so automatically taken for reality. And so, but to answer Kantbot's earlier question, I would say about the mutation, I would say there's a very important mutation that basically happens in the liberal establishment literally at the end of World War II. And what happens is that these people finally realize that Stalin is actually in it for himself, and that because there were always kind of two kinds of Americans that worked with the USSR. There were the really naive people that Stalin just took advantage of. And then there were the people that thought that they were taking advantage of Stalin, but Stalin was actually taking advantage of them. And so, at the end of the war, they realized that basically their theory has been what was called at the time, the grand design, which you see reflected in the structure of the United Nations, which is kind of intended to be like, American expertise rules the world and the Soviet Union is our strong right arm. And of course, this is what it was during World War II. It helped us conquer Europe, or maybe we helped them conquer Europe. At least, we split it. And then these very, very talented bureaucrats in D.C., people like Dean Acheson, or the Dulles brothers, realized, no, actually, these people do not intend to work for us. And at that point, they're like, okay, then we need to spread our own revolution to compete with their revolution. And so you have all this CIA rhetoric, which you've no doubt seen Kantbot about, the good revolution and, the opposite of violent revolution is peaceful revolution, great RFK quote. The whole idea of the Green Berets with De Oppresso Liber is like, we're going to go out and start our own revolutions. And
Green Berets started by JFK.
Yeah. But that originates in World War II tendencies. And so, there was sort of all this where, people love to play. I mean, there was this whole playing James Bond period, right? Which is where, the James Bond character comes from. And, this idea of basically being a professional revolutionary, or a professional guerrilla, even working for freedom and democracy, that was field tested in World War II. And so the thing is, anyone who thinks that there are any seriously new cultural tendencies or ideas in America in the 1960s is just completely wrong.
And there's something about like how there's really no there's no ideological meaning to like how neo-Nazis and how like neo-Marxism, like it's almost like not really important like what those two factions believe. It's just like, here's this shadow war that's going on, and like, the CIA is mobilizing like neo-Nazis and across Europe to like fight the communists. It's like it's not even important to them that it's like Nazism.
No. I mean, the thing is that the ruling, the ruling classes, here I go with my Marxism again. The earlier you go in the 20th century, the farther the kind of distance between the elite narrative and the popular narrative gets. And so, if you look at narratives of, say, World War I, like down basically at the popular level for like ordinary, human beings, basically, what do they see? They see, we must fight the Hun who is coming to rape your sister, right? You're like, appears to be a war fought by 11-year-olds. You've seen World War I propaganda. You're like, this is for 11-year-olds, right? And the thing is, are the people who are actually making the decisions and, really running the country, are they thinking like 11-year-olds? Of course not. They have, they're sort of wheels within wheels within wheels, right? You look at the kind of internal narrative of the American governing classes during the Roosevelt administration, and like, it's just completely different from what people think the New Deal is. I mean, people don't even know Roosevelt uses a wheelchair, right? And so in a way, you're basically like, the proper way to think about when you sort of compare the public narrative to the actual narrative of governance is sort of as different as comparing like Soviet propaganda to the actual Soviet Union. And if you study the actual Soviet Union in terms of the Soviet propaganda, you're just wasting your time.
I feel like this... continue.
Sorry, go on. Yeah, no, please.
I just feel like this continues on something you were saying about the quote, all states are ruled by elites who subdue their subjects with illusions, and these illusions are what you called a political formula and cousins of stage magic. Do you think this is what's behind this kind of fake dichotomy of this current neo-Nazi, neo-Marxist circus?
Well, no, I think that there's nothing really behind that, and this is the thing. It's just like I just posted this piece